Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be reviewing some books that I've recently read, 7 to be exact. I've had a really good start to my reading year this year. I've read 13 books so far, 7 of which I'll be talking about today and reviewing. We have 2 adult, 4 YA, and 1 middle grade, so we got a variety. I read 1 literary fiction, 1 nonfiction, 2 contemporary, and 3 fantasy. So without further ado, let's just get into it. The first book that I read was There by Tommy Orange. This is a novel following 12 indigenous characters who are all heading to a powwow in Oakland, California. The setting of Oakland is actually an important part of this book as it sets the foundation for the central theme, which is the idea of being an urban Indian. These are Native people and communities that live in big cities and who perhaps don't share the same experiences as those traditionally told about Native American communities and those living on reservations. The author himself grew up in Oakland, and through this novel and through all its characters, he's kind of trying to portray just like the dynamics of this community. So 12 is a lot of characters to follow, and in the beginning, the stories and the characters feel very disparate. Their perspectives vary in age, in tone, in timelines even. We are in like the 70s at one point and then modern day at another. But gradually as you go through the story, you start to realize how each character is connected and to whom. It takes a little bit of time. It's a little confusing in the beginning, but I would say around the 1/3 mark, things start to make sense, things start to click, and it does elevate the story to another level. With a book that follows so many characters, there is a risk that you won't have as much time to really develop the characters or grow to understand them. And I think it's a testament to Tommy Orange's writing that he's able to fully flesh out a lot of these characters in such a short amount of time. And because we have multiple perspectives, we are actually able to dive more in depth into the greater themes of the book because you can see how different people relate to a single issue. For instance, one central theme of the book is the relationship people have to being Native. Some people are very connected to their culture, while others are not, but are trying to be, and some are not and are not trying to be. There's also a lot of really insightful ideas about how to be connected to the land in a city where everything feels artificial. There's also some exploration of darker issues like alcohol abuse, gang violence, and domestic abuse. And so I was just really impressed by how much the author was able to cover in a relatively short book. In between some parts of the book, there are kind of like interludes where the author includes more context about Native American history or culture, which I found very effective in being able to ground those thematic connections that we saw in each perspective, in addition to just the relational ones and how people are related to each other. And so with all that together, the history, the perspective, the multi-generational aspect of this story, and also the writing, Tommy Orange is a fantastic writer and has these really insightful and reflective passages. All that together, I just had a really great experience with this book and found myself thinking about it long after I finished it. And I'm curious now to check out the sequel/prequel, Wandering Stars, that he released this year. Oh, and I gave this book 4.5 stars. So now, switching gears from that literary fiction, we are now going to go to a YA rom-com called Eliza from Scratch by Sophia Lee. This actually has not come out yet. I got an ARC from NetGalley, but it does come out on May 13th later this year. So this is about a high school senior named Eliza Park who is up for salutatorian and bound for MIT. However, at the beginning of the school year, there is a scheduling mishap, and instead of being placed in AP Physics, she's put in Culinary Arts. Not only is her position as salutatorian now on the line, but she also has to get used to being the clueless person in the class for once, in a class that she didn't even want to take to begin with. However, when it is announced that the winner of the end-of-term culinary competition will get a boost to their GPA, Eliza starts to take culinary arts seriously. But that means she'll have to beat out her partner, Wesley, who is normally a C student, but is actually annoyingly good at cooking. So you can see from that description how this book sets up a kind of rivals to lovers dynamic, but another really important part of this story is the relationship that Eliza has with her mom. At the beginning of the story, you find out that Eliza's grandmother had passed away a few months before, and that her mother has kind of been withdrawn and not herself since then. And so as Eliza learns how to cook in class in school, she also asks her mom to teach her the recipes that her grandmother had in order to try to get her mom out of this rut and bring her back to herself, but also for Eliza to feel more connected to her Korean heritage. So what actually drew me to pick up this book was the fact that the author is actually a former booktuber, Bookish Sophia. I used to watch her videos all the time, and I loved seeing her describe the process of writing this book. And this book had a lot of ingredients, pun intended, to be something that I really enjoyed, but unfortunately, it didn't all come together as well as I wanted it to. One of my main issues came down to the main characters and how, frankly, insufferable they were. In the beginning, Eliza and her friends are extremely judgmental and elitist towards kids who are not in the AP or honors classes. And when Eliza is put in this culinary class, they are convinced that she is going to win the competition simply because she's an honors kid and the others are not, and how could she possibly not beat out the non-honors kids? But what's worse is that this bleeds into her relationship with Wesley, who she has such internal judgment for, and sometimes external judgment for this reason. And the narrative tries to convince us that Wesley is some jerk to her and kind of an asshole, and that justifies Eliza being sort of mean back to him and making fun of the fact that he's not like an A student. But in reality, he's not that bad. Like, I did not think he was that mean to justify that extent of Eliza's behavior towards him. I do have to acknowledge that this was intentional, that this was a point of character growth for Eliza. And I do recognize this is a YA book, and so the characters might not be the most mature because they are teenagers. And I do reframe my review, my judgment based on that. But I think what bothered me the most about how this particular character arc was handled was that it just felt very superficial in contrast to how a lot of other issues in this book were handled. So for instance, there's a lot of really insightful passages about being a child of immigrants, the shame of not knowing the language, of not being connected to the culture, and the shame of not being totally impacted by the death of her grandmother who lived in Korea. There was also a really interesting friendship conflict that was portrayed in this, where one person in Eliza's friend group doesn't feel that she can trust or communicate with Eliza. And the reason for that having a lot of nuance and complication, something that has been built up for a long time and that can't just be solved overnight, which I thought was really realistic. Even going back to the academics aspect, there's a really nice part where Eliza is really grappling with not having a passion and realizing that she doesn't really have a drive. She just kind of does whatever she's good at, which is such a realistic thing for academic high achievers or just anyone who is in that transition of going to college and actually trying to figure out what they want to do with their life. Aside from the friendship conflict, a lot of these things were pretty small parts of the story, but they did have a lot of interesting ideas and nuance that were brought up that I wish were kind of put more at the forefront. In contrast, the main issue and the main point of character development for Eliza felt very shallow in comparison. The main lesson she has to learn is that perhaps people are not dumb because they aren't in AP classes or don't get straight A's and perhaps may have talents elsewhere. I do have to acknowledge my bias in that I have been in circles like this similar to Eliza, have been in conversations where you have to interrogate academic elitism, but at least in my experience, it's not as outright as it was in this book, and I think it would have been perhaps more insightful, more helpful to interrogate the more subtle ways that these kind of attitudes of academic elitism can manifest when you are always surrounded by people who are like-minded to you. Oop, camera died, so slight angle change. But finally, I'll just talk about the writing briefly. I found it to be quite hit or miss. I liked the more expository, reflective passages that were in the story. That's where I found the more interesting and introspective ideas that I talked about earlier. But I did find some of the more narrative and dialogue passages to be slightly stilted at times. So unfortunately, this book just ended up not working for me, and I gave it 2 stars. But if you find that you are still interested in the synopsis, I would encourage you to still check this out. I am not the direct target audience of this story, so perhaps you might connect to it in a way that I didn't. So now another left turn, we're going to go into a nonfiction book, and that is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a professor of botany, but is also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and so she has this unique perspective of plants and nature informed by both scientific training as well as by the teachings of her culture growing up. In her training, she was always told to appeal to a certain level of scientific objectivity and also reject Indigenous wisdom, but in this book, she really advocates for the merging of those two. She advocates for a reframing of how we see the earth and how we seek knowledge, because both are needed to fully understand the earth. She mixes memoir with native stories and native history with some sociology to explore not only how we can learn about the earth and cultivate a relationship with the earth, but also how we can learn about people and society through the teachings of plants. So this book is kind of hard to review because it is nonfiction and it's not the general framework that I use to evaluate my enjoyment of stories. But I guess the first thing that I do need to highlight is that this book was extremely enlightening. It definitely succeeded in having me reframe my own relationship with the environment and how I see the world and its creations. The central thesis of this book is the idea of reciprocity. What we take from the earth, we should give back in some way, and what we give to the earth will be returned to us in some form or another. And she uses that to explore our direct relationship with the environment and how to live more sustainably, while also critiquing the culture of overconsumption and capitalism that we live in currently. So, like I said, this book is extremely impactful, but I do have to be honest that it took me so long to read, like well over a year. I truly loved what the book was saying, but at times it did feel repetitive, which made it hard to feel motivated to pick it up at times. And I think that's why I tended to like the more unique chapters, or the ones that had more unique applications of the ideas. For instance, one of the last chapters is called Collateral Damage, which was my favorite, I think. In that one, she talks about the ways that we can so easily view some lies as just collateral damage of the world that we live in, whether that's salamanders crossing the road on a rainy night, or people in Iraq who are being killed by US sent bombs. So overall, I do think Braiding Sweetgrass is one of those books that I think everyone should read at least once in their lifetime. I do recommend probably just taking it slowly, not feeling like you have to finish it immediately, just taking it chapter by chapter and really trying to absorb what it's saying. I think when it comes to nonfiction, I mainly just evaluate how much I learned and how accessible was the language and being able to convey those ideas. And in that sense, the book succeeded, and I ultimately gave it 4 stars. Next, we have Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is a YA fantasy standalone following a girl named Elizabeth Scrivener, who all her life has been growing up in a library, one of the great libraries in this world, in fact, surrounded by grimoires full of the secrets to the magical world. All her life, she's dreamed of becoming a library warden and protecting these grimoires, specifically from sorcerers who she believes are evil and are just waiting for the opportunity to provoke the grimoires and release their monstrosities to the world. One day, though, one of the library's most dangerous grimoires gets released, and Elizabeth ends up being implicated in the crime. So now she must ally with one of the most infamous sorcerers, Nathaniel Thorn, in order to clear her name and find out who actually stole the grimoire. This book was such a fun ride. The vibes were definitely giving Howl's Moving Castle and Tangled a little bit. The Tangled vibes I got mainly from the main character, Elizabeth. She has a similar essence and energy of having a lot of eagerness and knowledge about the world because she grew up in the library, but also having a naivete because everything that she learned was from books. There were some times that I was worried that this portrayal was going to go the route of infantilizing Elizabeth, especially in her developing relationship with Nathaniel, which I don't think is a spoiler. But I would say for the most part that it doesn't, and it's because I think Elizabeth has such an agency and a drive to her that allows her to hold her own. Now, speaking of the romance, I actually was kind of surprised that there was not as much romance in this. I don't know if this was marketed by the publisher as romantasy, but it was definitely marketed to me as romantasy from TikTok. And so I was just surprised that I feel like the romance was not as much of a center as I thought it would be. A lot of it does have to do with the mystery aspect, and the romance kind of just gradually follows with that. But what we did have of the romance, though, I ate up, and I liked the fact that it was done so gradually. Like I said, this had Howl's Moving Castle and Tangled energy, so I just knew that I was going to eat up their dynamic and their banter. But I will say that I think the setup of their relationship was a little stronger than the actual relationship. I feel like the author didn't really know what to do with them once they got together, and it felt like all that tension from when they were about to be together just kind of dissipated, but I still appreciated the ride. One of my favorite aspects of the story that I don't see talked about as much is the character of Silas, who is Nathaniel's demon companion. In this world, mortals can make deals with demons in order to get magic in exchange for some amount of years of their life. But Nathaniel was very young when he made this deal with Silas, and so their relationship is kind of different than other demon sorcerer relationships. Silas has this kind of like guardian father almost relationship with him, which I loved and I found so sweet. One of my favorite themes in literature, I'm realizing, is the idea of monstrosity and the ability to go against what you were so-called bred to be, what is inherent in your nature. That's kind of a little specific for a trope, but I feel you can get what I mean, what those kind of stories are. And I loved it here. While I do think this book works as a standalone, I did end the book feeling like there could be more, there should be more of the story, and I just recently found out that there is a sequel novella that came out. So I'll definitely be checking that out, because I just found this world and these characters to just be so enjoyable, and I gave it 4 stars. Next up is a middle grade supernatural fantasy, and that is Amari and the Despicable Wonders by B.B. Alston. This is the 3rd book in the Supernatural Detective series, the first one being Amari and the Night Brothers. This series is about a 12-year-old girl named Amari who, in an effort to find her missing brother Quentin, finds out about a secret society called the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, who are kind of the regulators of the interactions of the supernatural and human world. Think kind of like Men in Black. And obviously this is the 3rd book, so I can't really give too much of what the plot is without spoiling the first 2 books, but I'll try my best to describe this series in general and what I thought of this installment. So I've been actually really enjoying this series. I gave the first 2 books around 4 stars, but this one was definitely my favorite. There's something about the 3rd book in a series I noticed. The stakes are higher, the characters are more developed, that I eat it up in so many series. The 3rd one is just where the tables turn. And I love it because when you introduce more stakes, you also introduced more tension and conflict between the characters that really challenge them, which I love. And that was the case in this book. One of the things that I loved about this book was the relationship and the conflict between Amari and her older brother Quentin. There's a kind of big age gap between them, like 10 years. And so Quentin does have this more protective guardian role over Amari. He wants her to just follow orders and stay safe and not really explore the bounds of her powers and her abilities as an agent. And Amari understands that, but also knows that she needs to do what she knows is right and will help the most people, and also just has a desperate need to prove that she is capable of making those kinds of decisions. And so I love getting to see her work through that relationship, through that conflict, especially in contrast to her relationship with Agent Magnus, who is also a guardian figure. He's the one who trained her how to be an agent. And I just loved how through this we were really able to see Amari grow in this book. Not to mention the fact that there are actual more consequences in this book, bringing it back to stakes. In the end, it had me shedding a tear. I was so moved and sad by what happened. The pacing in this book is also perfect in my opinion. There were no points at which I was bored. There's a great blend of action, mystery, character development, and also humor. I forgot to mention that the series is really funny. It's kind of that Percy Jackson sense of humor where you have the kind of silliness of seeing how these supernatural creatures are adapting to the modern world. And the specific creatures chosen are also kind of fun, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a character. So it's just overall a delight. There were a few small things that held this book back from being a full 5 stars, but they were all kind of relatively minor. One is that I still want more depth to the main antagonist of this series. I won't say who to avoid spoilers. I think we start to get more in this book and start to learn more of his motivations. But with how this book ended, I'm really curious how the next 2 books in this series are going to go with him. So we'll see where that ends up. Another thing that was more obvious in this book is that there is obviously kind of a setup for a romance between Amari and Jaden, who was one of her friends, which I am very down for, except for the fact that we don't really get much Jaden in this series, not to the extent of any of the other side characters. We don't really know much about him and his depth. It's all pretty small instances. And it just became more apparent in this book that they are definitely setting this up without laying the necessary groundwork for it. And so I'm definitely going to need them to do more development on Jaden's side for the next 2 books. But overall, this series is really well worth a read if you are looking for a middle grade fantasy, supernatural fantasy that also tackles allegories for racism and xenophobia. And I gave this installment 4.5 stars. The next book is Icarus by K. Ancrum, another YA contemporary. And I had heard a lot about K. Ancrum's books, namely The Wicker King and The Weight of Our Stars, but this was the one that eventually got me to pick it up because it was an Icarus retelling and I love Greek mythology. And also, I don't think there are many retellings of the Icarus story, so I was really excited about that. In this book, Icarus is a high schooler by day and art thief for his dad at night. His father makes art forgeries, and Icarus has been trained to kind of sneak into these houses, one house in particular of a man named Mr. Black, whom Icarus's father has a feud with and who he blames for the death of Icarus's mother. Because of the nature of this job, Icarus has been taught to not let anyone get close, to not let anyone touch him, and to above all not get caught. One day, though, Icarus does get caught by Mr. Black's mysterious son, Helios, who is under house arrest. Surprisingly, he does not rat out Icarus, but instead bargains for something else, his friendship. This is a book that I had a lot of mixed feelings on, mostly positive, but definitely mixed. So I'll first start with the premise. So the fact that a high schooler is a professional art thief does require some suspension of your disbelief. But for the most part, I found that I didn't mind it that much, but I did think that this story might have benefited from having a little magic to it. Something in the vein of fabulism or magical realism, simply because of this kind of juxtaposition of this wacky premise in an otherwise mundane world with mundane characters. And I think it also has to do with the fact that this is an Icarus retelling paired with K. Ancrum's beautiful writing. It just left you with a sense of like kind of wanting more and expecting there to be more. Like it felt like it was set up to be somewhat magical or surreal, but then wasn't, which was kind of a weird experience. And perhaps that's just my personal preference and that juxtaposition was intentional by the author, but it's just something that I noticed that I thought would improve the story if it had it. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy how this story was portrayed at times. I actually really enjoyed the interpretation of the Icarus story that K. Ancrum went with. I think a lot of times when we think of the Icarus story, we think of the phrase like, oh, he flew too close to the sun, kind of this indictment of hubris and flying beyond your means only to melt and fall. However, in this book, the author decided to focus more on the relationship between Icarus and Daedalus, his father, and how Icarus was secluded from the world and locked away due to the mistakes, or sins, if you will, of his father. And so it is only natural for someone who has been sheltered his entire life to reach for the sun if the opportunity came for it. And I just found that perspective to be so touching, so poetic, and it made me look at the Icarus myth with new perspective, which is exactly what I want from a retelling. And so I love that overall framework and message and interpretation of the myth, but I do think where the story kind of fell was in the actual execution of those myth elements. For instance, I had a lot of mixed feelings about the way that the friendship and eventual romance between Icarus and Helios developed. It was incredibly sweet at times, incredibly tender moments, and I loved that Helios kind of served as this wake-up for Icarus to realize that he deserves more than the life that his father promised him. But I felt like those moments existed in isolation without actually having a foundation for them. It felt very fast and very sudden, which was a little bit disappointing. And also things just start to get kind of wacky once we start to uncover what happened between Icarus's dad and Helios's dad. It required even more suspension of disbelief that kind of just like took me out of the story. Again, I think these parts would have benefited from having some sort of magic to them, some sort of whimsy, I don't know, because they did require a suspension of disbelief, but it took you out of the story because the rest of the story felt very realistic and mundane. Whereas if the story had a foundation of magical realism or fabulism, it wouldn't have felt so jarring. Speaking of the more realistic side of the story, I think I actually enjoyed that part more than the actual myth elements in the book. We follow Icarus while he goes to school, and it's kind of interesting because you realize just how much the narrative and the perspective is stuck in Icarus's head, in the sense that he is not necessarily an unreliable narrator, but definitely a biased narrator in his perceptions of the people around him. He was raised to believe that he couldn't form close bonds, and so he kind of shuts himself out and doesn't really pay attention to the other people in his class, and he assumes they do the same of him. But that's not the case. They do notice him, and they do notice when he's struggling and when he needs support. And I found that portrayal of a kind of implicit community to be so beautiful and so reassuring, especially for readers who are young adults in high school. So as you saw, my thoughts were all over the place. There were some things that I really loved, but I just felt like the execution didn't match it as much. So I ultimately landed on a 3-star. But this is one of those cases where I feel like the star rating doesn't necessarily match how I would recommend it. Because I think I still would highly recommend this. I think it's a really interesting story. I don't think I've read many stories like it before, especially if you are in high school or just a YA age group. I think you might connect and feel seen by the story. I also think you would like this if you liked Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. It kind of has a similar setup where it's like the premise is a little bit hard to believe, a little bit wonky, but it ends up covering like a really serious subject matter. So if you liked that, then check this one out. Finally, the last book that we have to talk about today is Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the second book in the Letters of Enchantment series, the first one being Divine Rivals. Divine Rivals was one of my favorite books last year, so I was very eager to finally get to this sequel. It's like a World War I era inspired fantasy following two journalists, Iris and Roman, who are connected by these magical typewriters who can only communicate with each other. In the first book, they end up getting tangled up in a war between two gods, Enva and Dacre. And in this book, we are obviously dealing with the aftermath of that situation. I knew going into this book that I was going to have a certain baseline level of enjoyment simply because of Rebecca Ross's writing style. Like, I don't know what it is about her, but I will eat anything up that she writes. She is such a talented writer. She's able to convey love and yearning in such a deep and authentic way that like never gets old. And that's especially evident through the letters that we see between Iris and Roman. And through certain circumstances in this book, we kind of get to see Iris and Roman fall in love with each other again and kind of fall in love with each other's words. But I do have to say that I did leave this book a little disappointed, and it's mainly because of the world building. While I love Divine Rivals, I did think that the world building was not its strongest point, definitely the weak part of the story. But in Divine Rivals, the connection and the romance between Iris and Roman was such a forefront of the story, and what they were going through was such like a bigger part that I didn't care as much that we weren't getting as much development about the gods in this war. However, in this book, the gods play a much bigger role. One of the gods, Dacre, is like an active character that we see. And I really liked the scenes that Dacre had with Roman. They were really compelling, really chilling sometimes. However, once we do get more backstory on the war and why this is happening and what the characters' motivations are, things do start to kind of fall apart. It does feel a little weak. That was something that I could let go of because gods having trivial reasons for war that cause like enormous bloodshed for the mortals and humans in the world is not like an uncommon thing that happens in fantasy books. But I think what did it for me was ultimately the ending of the book. The final battle was over in like 2 seconds, and how it was resolved was also quite underwhelming. And I was just left with this feeling of like, that's it. That's what we went through all of this for. So it's like not only was the war itself not really justified, not really convincing, but how we solved it also, like, we could have done this whole time. It was just kind of like, what was this all for? And gave me the vibe that Rebecca Ross kind of didn't know how to end the story, maybe, or wanted to insert more world building because that was a common complaint of the first book, but didn't know how to execute it as well, or didn't have enough setup from the first book to be able to execute it well in the sequel. I don't know. And it made it so difficult to rate because the ending kind of really soured my perspective on the whole book, despite me enjoying a lot of it. And I feel like I'm harping so much on all of these things that I disliked and made it seem like I hated the book, when that's not really the case. I was really hooked for a lot of it. But it kind of just goes to show that if you fumble the ending, that sour feeling is what you're going to be left with after finishing. So ultimately I gave this 3.5 stars. I think that kind of captures my overall feelings for it. And definitely let me know what you thought of this book if you've read it. So those are all the books that I have today, basically everything that I read in January. Please let me know your thoughts on any of these books that I mentioned, or if you're interested in picking them up now. Or if you just want to let me know that you made it all the way to the end of this video, you can leave an emoji, maybe a wing for Icarus. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see more, please consider subscribing to my channel. And otherwise, I'll see you later for the next one. Bye.